And a dictatorship composed of mullahs in white robes or grey robes, whatever colour it is no different. They are just as corrupt, if not more corrupt, and everybody knows it. The man in the street and the woman in the street knows this. That these mullahs are filling their pockets, that they're just as bad as anybody else. This is a useless regime. It's an anti-populist. People know this. After 30 years, the people of Iran, most of them anyway, are up to here with the mullahs. Fed up, especially the youth and the women, who of course have been turned into the marvelous women of Iran who've shown their courage now, but coming onto the streets. And that's one of the most interesting things about the last week. It's very unusual to see men and women on the streets, no question, no discrimination, fighting together. The women of Iran have stood up and said, we've had enough of this, had enough of being treated as second-class citizens in our own land. And the youth of Iran is tired of all the petty restrictions and all kinds of the nonsense that these mullahs have put across. They're tired of this after 30 years. And here's an interesting point, if you didn't know it. 70% of the population of this gigantic country, I think the population is 70 million, isn't it, Anna? I think it's 70 million. It's a very big country anyway. 70% of this gigantic country are under 30 years of age. Therefore, they've never known any other regime than this. They've never known any other life, and they are fed up to here with it. If you add to that, if you add to this enormous accumulation, 30 years of frustration, of despair, of discontent, which is accumulated under the surface for 3 decades, if you add to that the economic crisis, the crisis of world capitalism, which has hit Iran as it's hit every other country, with the falling price of oil, although I think it's rallied a bit lately, but that doesn't matter. They've not got the same, the mullahs and Ahmadinejad have not got the same room to maneuver that they had previously. Although it's true that the press has pointed out, I think it's fair to say that Ahmadinejad still has some points of support, mainly in the rural areas, among the backward peasantry, strongly under the influence of religion, and he's given certain concessions on the basis of oil wealth. They could afford that. They gave certain reforms to the poorest section. They have some support, it is true. But that's finished. As a matter of fact, no matter who wins, no matter who wins this particular struggle, whatever government is in Tehran, they will have to carry out a policy of cuts and austerity like every other government in the capitalist world, because the capitalist crisis will force them to do so. But the economic crisis has also had an effect among the middle class, the workers, of course. Well, there's one little detail. I noticed this 10 years ago when the students began to move. There was a student movement 10 years ago in Iran. I wrote articles at the time, which you can read on the website. You can read what I wrote. And the article, the main article, was entitled First Shots of the Iranian Revolution. In other words, I described that. That was an anticipation. I stated that at the time. Because the students, Trotsky explains this very brilliantly. The students and the intellectuals are not able to play an independent role in society. That's quite clear. They haven't got the necessary weight to do this. But the students and the intelligentsia are an accurate barometer. They're a faithful barometer of the tensions and the contradictions that are building up within the bowels of society. And they can react before other classes. They're very set, they can move fast. It's happened historically on many occasions. It happened in Russia in 1900, 1901 to 1903, where there were big student demonstrations, and the students in Tsarist Russia were from rich families, and from middle class and bourgeois families. Those student demonstrations in Russia were an anticipation of the working class revolution, the first revolution that took place starting in January 1905. Same thing in Spain. 1930, 1931, there were big student demonstrations, again, from bourgeois families, but Trotsky said that's a symptom which shows the way things are developing. 10 years ago, you had the beginnings of this, rumblings in society. They put that movement down fairly quickly by the most brutal means, beating up students, torturing them, and some of them were killed, imprisoned, and so on and so forth. And it seemed that was finished, but we predicted at that time that was an anticipation of a major explosion that was going to take place. Let me tell you what a revolution is. Let's describe it in terms much better than what I could describe it. This is from Trotsky's great masterpiece, The History of the Russian Revolution, where he says the following in the preface to Volume 1. He actually asks the question, which people don't tend to ask, what is a revolution? What is it? And he answers in the following sense. The most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. In ordinary times, the state, be it monarchical or democratic, or I could add, mullah, elevates itself above the nation, and history is made of specialists in that line of business: kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, journalists. Don't we know it? But at those crucial moments, when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break over the barriers, excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create, by their own interference, the initial groundwork for a new regime. Whether this is good or bad, we leave to the judgment of moralists. We ourselves will take the facts as they are given by the objective course of development. I think that is an extraordinary definition and describes precisely what is taking place. Now, you see, it's quite a curious turn of affairs, because it is clear that Khamenei and Ahmadinejad obviously thought that everything was nicely tied up. They must have been quite confident to call an election. I mean, there have been elections before, but this time they even encouraged some elements of debate. There was a debate on television between the candidates and so on and so forth. In the past, the Iranians didn't bother with these elections because elections in Iran didn't solve anything. Nobody was interested in these elections. But this time it was different. Because of the accumulation of discontent, of frustration and anger within the population, they were looking for a point of expression, and they found it in this election. To the astonishment of everybody, they were massed towards the end of the campaign. Not at the beginning, there was the same indifference, but then it changed. The mood of the people changes very quickly in a revolutionary situation. The mood will change and the ideas will change very quickly. Towards the end of the campaign, there were mass rallies, unprecedented rallies in Tehran. Unprecedented rallies, particularly around Mousavi, this chap. Now, Hegel, marvelous, profound philosopher, once said he said many profound things, but one of the most brilliant things that he said, necessity expresses itself through accident. In other words, you can have the build-up, where you have a build-up of enormous, massive discontent, which is not evident on the surface. Everything is peaceful, everything is calm. That's what the mullahs thought. Everything is nicely tied up. But this enormous seething discontent is building up. It is seeking a way out, and it will find a way out. It can find a way out in the most peculiar ways. For example, for the campaign around Mousavi. Now, Mousavi is an accidental figure. He's an historical accident, to use a dialectical expression. Mousavi is not a genuine oppositionist. He's certainly not a revolutionary. He was part of the regime. Good heavens, he was the prime minister, I think, during the war between Iran and Iraq. Well, 1 million Iranians lost their lives, by the way. A war provoked by imperialism, by the way. At that time, they were supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran, because Iran was seen as the main enemy. They supported and they armed and they instigated that war, which is a criminal war, which 1 million Iranians lost their lives. I think a similar amount of Iraqis lost their lives in this terrible war. Mousavi was the prime minister at that time, so he's not a left-wing. And therefore, here's an interesting question. You see, the regime, Khamenei and co, could have avoided all this mess quite easily.